Did Joseph Smith drink alcohol even after the revelation on the word of wisdom? Well, believe it or not, yeah, he did. And most members of the church drank alcohol, tea, coffee, and smoked and chewed tobacco up until the early 1900s. But to be clear, the historical record shows that Joseph Smith was a moderate drinker. He would only drink occasionally and never got drunk. In fact, Joseph Smith hated drunkenness. So why did the church leaders and church members drink alcohol, coffee, tea, and smoked and chewed tobacco up until the 1900s, even after the word of wisdom was given? Well, that's because the word of wisdom was originally introduced and given as, well, a word of wisdom and not a commandment. So if we go to section 89 and verse 2, this is how the word of wisdom is introduced. It says, "It is not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation and the word of wisdom." Now, why was it not a commandment at first, but now it is? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but in verse 3, it kind of hints at it, in my opinion. It says, "Given for a principle with promise, adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints." So I believe it was introduced to be adapted to the personal level in the beginning. Because if you think about it, in the 1830s, when this was introduced, the alcohol consumption was at least twice as much as it is now, which is kind of crazy. So if it was introduced as a commandment, I think a lot of members would have struggled greatly with this and would have been kind of abrupt. So I think out of mercy, the Lord introduced it as a word of wisdom to be adapted to each person. It kind of reminds me of the higher law with Moses and the children of Israel, right? Where first he was given the higher law, but they weren't ready for that, so he gave them a lesser law. I'm not saying this is exactly the case, but it kind of reminds me of that. But anyways, so they started adapting it personally, and they were doing better and better. And in 1850s, Brigham Young invited everybody to commit and covenant to fully abstain. But even after this kind of took a while to be implemented fully. And like I said earlier, church leaders and members still drank and didn't fully keep the word of wisdom until as late as 1901. But as the older generation kind of grew old and the newer generation grew up knowing about the word of wisdom, I think it got a little easier. And in 1919, President Heber J. Grant, the first presidency, made observing the word of wisdom a requirement for receiving the temple recommend. So now, in order to obtain the temple recommend and go into the temple, we need to abstain from coffee, black or green tea, alcohol, and drugs. So that's kind of the quick history of how the word of wisdom became a commandment or requirement. If you're troubled by why some of these things are in the word of wisdom, just think back to the law of Moses and in Christ's time. They couldn't eat pork back then. That was part of their health code. But we could eat pork now, so why the change? I can't answer that question, but I know that God does these things for our own good.